with many considerable personal attributes, a life experience, and she brings a dedication and a loyalty and a friendship that I value very much to the role of Deputy Leader of our party. And would you please thank again a wonderful inspiration to many women in our party and around the country, a great friend to all that is good within our party, and Susan will make a great minister, as she was in the last government, in the next government. Susan, thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Liberals friends, thank you very much for being here for the 64th Liberal Party Federal Council. I want to say thank you very much, firstly, to our President, John Olsen, to Charlie Taylor and to Andrew Hurst. Their stewardship and their sage advice as our Federal President, our Honorary Federal Treasurer, and of course as the Federal Director is the gold standard. I'm so grateful for the work that they do. I want to acknowledge Jeremy Rockcliffe as the wonderful Premier in Tasmania for the work that he's done to turn around that state and to demonstrate to all Australians, not just to Tasmanians, what it means to execute Liberal values and put them into action so that they can turn a bad situation inherited from a bad Labor government into a wonderful outcome and opportunity for young people. And Jeremy, the work that you've done has been quite remarkable. Thank you so much. Please. Thank you today to our state presidents, to the state directors, to all of the office holders, importantly the administrative staff, our advisors, to all of my colleagues who are here today, valued friends and confidants and people who contribute to the success that we've had in a very significant way. We aren't in the position we are today if we don't have that unity that's been spoken about time and time again through different speeches today. We don't have it without the support of my colleagues. I want to say thank you very much to each and every one of them for being here today and for putting us on the pathway to government. Would you please acknowledge all of our colleagues? Thank you also to our state and local government colleagues for being here today. You're an integral part of our Liberal Party brand and our messaging as we work out in the communities, particularly at a grassroots level. Can I say thank you to all of my shadow cabinet ministers here today. Simon Birmingham is up on stage, but to our leadership team, the work that the shadow cabinet has done. One of the things that we learnt, particularly during the Abbott years, and Andrew Robb played a very significant role in this, we needed to do the policy work early on. We needed to make sure that we reimagined what the Liberal Party would be in the eyes of Australians, and we have been able to put together policy which has been well considered, costed, and we're in the process of presenting obviously some of that to the Australian people. Most importantly, I celebrate and thank our loyal Liberal Party members and our volunteers whose efforts right across the country make us all feel so humble. They make our cause work and they make our country tick. And many of us have been involved for many decades. We've seen, as we did last night, people who have toiled for our party and to live up to Robert Menzies' vision for this party, in many cases for decades and decades, through every season. I want to say thank you to the men and women of the Liberal Party of Australia for their tireless efforts right across the country. Fellow Liberals friends, it is an honour to address you in our 80th year of Sir Robert Menzies' party. The great founder of our party, in his election campaign speech of 1949, Sir Robert said to the Australian people, "We must choose our road. Upon our decision will depend the future and fate of the nation." Well, friends, an election is, of course, on the horizon. It is likely to be an early election, but every election matters. And the forthcoming election matters more than others in recent history. The stakes are higher. The next election will not only define the next political term, it will define the future and fate of this nation. It will be about the kind of country Australians want our nation to be. And it will be a time for choosing. And I believe that the choice could not be clearer for the Australian people. A choice between an enduring cost of living crisis under Labor, where families are hurting, or cost of living relief under the Coalition. A choice between Labor's reckless renewables-only policy that will see the energy bills of Australians soar even more, or the Coalition's plan for cheaper, cleaner and consistent energy, which includes our visionary plan to become a nuclear-powered nation and to do the right thing by the environment. That is the choice that we have. It is a choice between the hollowing out of manufacturing in this country under Labor, or making our country a manufacturing powerhouse once again under a coalition government. A choice between an existing Labor government which has turned its back on small business and bloated the federal bureaucracy, or a new coalition which cuts red and green tape so that businesses can open, so that they can grow and thrive once again. A choice between an ongoing housing crisis that Labor's created, where Australians cannot afford to buy or to rent a home, or pressures coming off the housing market under the Coalition as we work to restore the great Australian dream of home ownership. A choice between a Labor government whose weaknesses and incompetence, displayed on a daily basis, compound crime, disorder and disunity on our streets and in our suburbs, or indeed a coalition government with a proven track record, one where we can provide the moral and political leadership which restores law, order and unity. To my fellow Australians, they know that leadership matters. For Australians, the next election will also be a choice about the type of leadership and the character that they expect from their Prime Minister. Now, I think Mr Albanese is a decent man who cares deeply about his country. But I also believe, and I know him well, and I've watched and observed him for 20 years, I know, as Australians now do, that he's completely out of his depth as Prime Minister. I believe he's compromised the honour of the office he holds. He's certainly broken at least 12 core promises, most egregiously in promising Australians prior to the election that they would be better off under a Labor government. There are pensioners this winter who are heating or eating but not both, who would have voted for Mr Albanese at the last election on the promise of a $275 reduction in their power prices. He promised it on 97 occasions, that they would see that reduction each and every year. He's never mentioned that figure since he's been elected over the course of the last 2 years. In truth, as we know, Australians are worse off, and they're paying much more for everything. More for food, more for petrol, for insurance, for rent, and certainly in their mortgages. Annual electricity bills for Australian households have gone up by almost $1,000. The Prime Minister's term has been defined by the wrong priorities. We know that instead of addressing the cost of living crisis, he dedicated his first 16 months in power to winning the Voice referendum at a cost of close to $500 million of taxpayers' money. Those precious months should have been spent in devising an economic plan to weather us through the difficult times that we're going through at the moment. Instead of taking the pressure off inflation by reining in wasteful spending, his government has lifted spending by a staggering $315 billion or $30,000 per Australian household. Instead of getting power prices down to help Australians, he set unachievable renewables and emissions targets which are blowing the budgets of Australians. The Prime Minister loves to jet around the world. Certainly he's more interested in appeasing the international climate lobby than sticking up for the interests of everyday Australians. He also keeps walking both sides of the street. For example, in Perth on the 8th of May, the Prime Minister spoke about the importance of gas for our nation's wealth and energy security. 2 days later, he was on ABC radio in Canberra, and he said, and I quote, "Not a single government dollar would be invested in gas under his Future Made in Australia plan. The people of the great state of Western Australia can pick a fraud from the East Coast. There's no doubt about that. And they've picked a fraud in this Prime Minister. Whatever audience Mr Albanese is addressing, he tells them what they want to hear, not what needs to be said. He's a political appeaser, not a leader of conviction, He avoids the hard and necessary decisions and the discussions because he places a higher value on political survival and statesmanship. The Prime Minister has divided our country, not just in relation to the voice vote, but in relation to other matters. When we look at what's happening in our society today, the Jewish community can attest to this and many others. The Prime Minister is preferencing and prioritising Green voters in inner city seats over Australians in the suburbs, in the outer metropolitan areas and across the country. We know that the shocking 700% rise in anti-Semitic incidents on our soil has come from a vacuum of moral courage and moral clarity from the man in the top job. Moreover, the Prime Minister shirked his responsibility to call out the CCP leadership for their military aggression, which put the lives of our men and women in uniform in danger, almost without precedent. He was more interested in pleasing Jacinda Ardern on immigration policy and placating John Setka on building policy than standing up for the interests of everyday Australians. Just as our Prime Minister has been weak, he's also been divisive. As I say, the Voice referendum sought to divide our country by ancestry and race. Labor's tax revisions have stirred up the ugly politics of envy, and the government's backward-looking industrial relations changes have pitted employers and employees against each other where there was no previous tension. The achievement of modern Australia wasn't built on division and disunity. In the last 2 years, Labor has made our economy more vulnerable, our nation less safe and certainly less secure, our society less cohesive, and Australians are worse off under the Albanese government at every level. Now, some Australians may think that by voting for the Greens or the Teals at the next election that things will improve. I can only offer some words of experience and of warning. If the Teals and or the Greens help Labor to form a minority government, the worst excesses of the Albanese government won't be moderated. We know that, and history demonstrates this, that on the contrary, it will be a very bad period for our country. The outcome will be a government which is even more radical and Greens heavy, and it's a fallacy that the Teals are disaffected Liberals. Consider their record on all votes in the Parliament which expose their true philosophy, true allegiances and true colour. Monique Ryan, for example, has voted with the Greens 74% of the time and with Labor 65% of the time. Zali Steggall protests her independence but has voted with the Greens 69% of the time and with Labor 70% of the time. Both have only voted with the coalition about 30% of the time. And while Teals like Monique Ryan and Zali Steggall hold the balance of power in a Labor government, if you imagine what that looks like, what would we see? We would see even more drastic renewables-only policies because, as we know, the Teals are owned and operated by somebody who is heavily invested into renewable energy. Simon Holmes à Court is a political player, and he is providing the talking points to these people. He's a person who would have as much influence over the Teals in a minority government as John Setka currently does over the Prime Minister of this country. With Greens like Adam Bandt holding the balance of power, what would we see? We would see progress on our great defence initiative in AUKUS put into jeopardy. There's no question about that. Remember, this is a man who refuses to stand in front of our national flag, and yet the Prime Minister would be prepared to stand side by side with him. The Greens have shifted from being a party of environmentalism under Bob Brown to a party of extremism under Adam Bandt. In the anti-Semitism they peddle and condone, the modern Greens party poses the greatest political threat to our social cohesion since the end of the Cold War. Australians can't afford another 3 years of the Albanese government. They also can't afford 3 years of the madness of minority government, comprising Labor, the Teals and or the Greens. Don't forget the manic nature of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd period. Australians should always remind themselves of that, going into any election where Labor says that everything will be okay. Australia is veering dangerously off track. More weak leadership will only make hard times even harder. difficult times require strong leadership to course correct our country. I will provide the Australian people that strong and decisive leadership, drawing on all that I've done as a police officer who served his community, as a successful small business owner who employed 40 people, as a patriotic Australian who has served the people of Australia for more than 2 decades, as a parliamentarian, including as Assistant Treasurer under John Howard and Peter Costello, and as a Senior Cabinet Minister. I'll be a Prime Minister who puts the views, the values and the vision of every Australian first. I'll be a leader who is fair and firm. I'll be someone who doesn't shirk the hard and necessary decisions which must be made in our national interest, particularly in these tough and precarious times. And I couldn't be prouder, as I say, of the team that I lead. A team of supremely capable men and women who possess courage, conviction and compassion. It's a team which combines the wisdom of experience with the youthful energy of many of our new parliamentarians. And we are united, as we've said. We are formidable. We're staying true to our principles. We have superb candidates, many of them here today, contesting seats across the country. Candidates who come from outside of politics, who have worked tough jobs, who have run businesses and who have raised families, who have contributed to our country, who have worn the uniform of our country. Candidates who understand the concerns and the hardships of everyday Australians. Fellow Liberals and friends, do I think that the Coalition can win the next election? You bet I do. We can and we must. Not because we win for winning's sake, but because, in Sir Robert Menzies' words, we are here to win something, to do something for our country. Fellow Liberals, we are here to get our country back on track. As we inch closer and closer to an election, I am confident that more and more Australians will appreciate that only the Coalition has a plan to do exactly this. Only the Coalition has a vision for our country aligned with expectations and aspirations of everyday Australians. Our plan to get our country back on track is a statement of our priorities and our policies. I want to reiterate some of what is important in terms of those priorities and policies today. Australians should be under no misapprehension. The cost of living crisis gripping our nation is of Labor's own making. Interest rates have now gone up on 12 occasions, and we know that core inflation is among the highest of the G20 nations. Australians are paying 20% more in personal income tax since the last election. And this is all because the Albanese government is failing on the key criteria of economic management. In last month's budget, it increased spending by $4 for every $1 it raised. And it's suffocating the economy and stymieing business with more red and green tape in a desire to increase government control over the free market. It's undermining competition by picking winners, such as providing over $13 billion in corporate welfare for those people who want to get into green hydrogen, critical minerals and renewable projects. We're into all of those projects ourselves. We support them, but we want the free market to be able to operate. And despite failed experiments overseas and the warnings they offer, it's pressing ahead with a renewables-only energy policy, which is proving to be a wrecking ball through the Australian economy. Our country is in a per capita recession and has been for 5 quarters. That means that average mums and dads are going backwards from pay packet to pay packet. The national accounts from the March quarter revealed an annual GDP growth of only 1.1%. Outside the pandemic, that's the weakest growth since 1991, when Labor last sought to destroy the economy. We do need a back-to-basics economic plan, and that is what the Coalition will deliver. We will rein in wasteful spending to take the pressure off inflation. We will remove those regulatory roadblocks to re-energise the economy and to allow businesses the freedom to flourish again. And we will deliver lower, simpler and fairer taxes for all to support cash flow and to help Australians get ahead. I want to commend Angus Taylor and Jane Hume and our economics team for the critical work that they have undertaken in this area. As Liberals, we understand the positive economic and social impact of small businesses around our country. But small and family businesses are decimated and demoralised by Labor's cost of living crisis. I want them to know that we are the party for them, that we have their back. Susan and Michaelia Cash are leading the charge for small business revival. Their experience is obvious to all in the policies that they're offering up. Our hand up to businesses starts with our commitment to extend the value of assets eligible for the instant asset write-off to $30,000 and to make this arrangement ongoing. And we've also committed to unwinding the complexity of Labor's industrial relations agenda, such as reverting to one simple definition of a casual worker. Among the many business sectors which have been hit hard under Labor, as we know, are construction companies. Some 5,000 have gone insolvent since the 1st of July 2022. And part of the problem, of course, has been the influence of the militant and lawless CFMEU in the Labor Party and on Labor governments. Union-backed companies are being awarded contracts on major infrastructure projects, despite sometimes bidding more than double their competitors. Taxpayers are not getting bang for their buck where the CFMEU is involved, and the Prime Minister may not stand up to John Secker and his gang of bullying thugs, but I promise you that I will. We will restore the rule of law. We will make sure that the construction industry watchdog is put back in place to make sure that we can deliver to Australians who rely on that infrastructure and the housing for them and their families. And we will double the penalties available to the courts to impose on criminals within the building sector. Getting our country back on track means playing to our strengths. The Labor Party, the Greens and the Teals continue to wage a crusade against our resource sector and primary industries in particular due to the influence of activists in their own rank and file. But at the next election, only the coalition can be trusted to support our miners, our farmers, our fishers and our foresters. And we do so unashamedly because we care about the lives and the livelihoods of these Australians and the communities that they buttress. And because we know that when these sectors do well, so does the rest of Australia. Australians will need to ask themselves important questions at the next election. Do they want their cities and communities to have well-built roads, schools and hospitals? Well, of course they do. Do they want the NDIS, Medicare and our aged care system to be well funded? Of course they do. Do they want our men and women in uniform to have the equipment they need to defend our nation? Of course they do. Well, we can only do these things with the support of the tens of billions of dollars in tax contributions and royalties paid annually by our primary industries, especially our mining and resources sector. My vision is to turbocharge these sectors for our greater national prosperity. And right now there is no more important area to fix than energy policy. And as I said, Labor's all eggs in one basket, renewables only approach is literally destroying our economy. The government is trying to roll out renewables at the same time as removing 90% of essential 24/7 baseload power from our system over the next decade. It has not worked anywhere in the world. And as a result, our grid is now more unreliable. Energy prices are continuing to soar and they're having an inflationary impact across the country. And Australians understand it because it's not just your power bill which is going up. The cost to farmers to grow, to fertilise and to harvest their crops is going up. The truck driver who transports the food faces higher electricity costs at the depot. The farmer and truck deliverers' costs are passed on, as well as the warehouse operator who packages and stores the food in freezers. Every part of that supply chain is affected by Labor's renewables only policy. And all of that upward pressure on cost is passed on to consumers at the checkout. And that is why, under Anthony Albanese, when you go to the supermarket checkout, you are paying more for every item in the basket. And that's why Labor's renewables only policy continues to hurt families, small businesses and our economy. Across the economy, in every aspect of production, in the supply of all goods and services, higher energy costs means Australians are paying more for everything. As electricity bills continue to go up and up for Australians under Labor's reckless plan, the worst is yet to come. The government's renewables rollout and rewiring the nation will cost $1.3 trillion, and that's a conservative estimate. As the CEO of Alinta Energy warned, Australians will have to pay more for energy into the future. AEMO, the independent regulator, recently warned of gas shortages, and that exposes this government's energy policy as a complete train wreck. Why, we must ask ourselves this question. Why is the Prime Minister, why is Chris Bowen pursuing a policy which is causing power bills of Australians to skyrocket? Why are they risking blackouts and brownouts across the nation that will drive manufacturers from our shores? And we know it's because their most important goal is to decarbonise our economy, to win the applause of global climate activists, but to do it in a way which is going to drive down our national productivity and cause long-term detriment. Labor's domestic energy policy has become a policy of international appeasement, and yet the government won't even meet its 2030 targets. The Clean Energy Council's reporting shows that the government was off track in its renewables rollout last year by almost 75%. There is zero chance of this rollout being completed. And indeed, Australia's emissions increased by 4 million tonnes in 2022-23. Will Mr Albanese reassess his targets and policy because Australians are hurting? No, he won't. He will double down and sign up to even more unrealistic emissions targets for 2035 in the order of 65 to 75%. But there's no economic modelling. We shouldn't forget that Australia contributes a little over 1% of global emissions, and I will not sign up to an arrangement where unachievable emissions targets and a reckless renewables-only rollout destroys our economy, makes businesses go broke and sends families bankrupt. But there is a credible pathway to meeting our commitment to net zero by 2050. The Coalition's energy policy will see Australia achieve our three goals of cheaper, cleaner and consistent power. In the more immediate term, we will ramp up domestic gas production to get power prices down and to restore stability in the grid. And we will join the other 19 top economies in the world which use zero-emission nuclear power or are taking steps to put it into the mix. This week I was pleased to join with David Littleproud, Ted O'Brien, Susan Lee and Angus Taylor to announce further parts of our policy to become a nuclear-powered nation. We propose, as you know, to build zero-emission, latest generation and proven nuclear power plants, either modern, larger plants or smaller modular reactors. And we've identified 7 locations and can use the existing distribution network. Each location has a coal-fired power station which is closed or is scheduled to close. Liddell and Mount Piper power stations here in New South Wales, Loy Yang power stations in Victoria, Tarong and Callide power stations in Queensland, and Northern Power Station in South Australia, and Mudgee Power Station in Western Australia, as places where all, as we know, all communities will benefit from that investment. It will attract thousands of jobs. I'd anticipated a number of comments in relation to the announcement that we made, but I did see one comment that I hadn't prepared for. There was a person that was interviewed in the Hunter, which we believe will be revitalised as a community. Thousands of jobs created. And that person in the Vox Pop featured on the news and said, "I'm not in favour of nuclear coming to the Hunter." And the interviewer said, "Well, why?" And that man said, "I'm worried about house prices going up because of the number of people who will move here to take up the new jobs." And he's right, and he is right. Labor has steamrolled over communities and dismissed their concerns in its reckless renewables-only rollout. He's treating Australians in a different way. If you live in Marrickville as a Green voter, you're at top of the list. If you live an hour west, an hour north-south, you're not on the radar. And a Prime Minister can't conduct himself or herself as somebody who is there for sectional interests and somebody who treats Australians in a differential way, but that's exactly what Anthony Albanese is doing right now. We respect Australians, and we will run through an engagement process for each community, and we will talk more about the economic and environmental benefit to our country as a result of our plan. We will answer people's questions, we will alleviate concerns, we'll speak about the social benefits of nuclear power and the way in which we can revitalise those towns that at the moment are full of shops with for lease signs on them. 2 of the 7 locations will become establishment projects, with nuclear plants to be built and operational in the second half of the 2030s. Our plan will see the majority of coal plant workers keep their jobs as they transition to nuclear plants. Hundreds more thousands more new and high-paying jobs will be created. Communities hosting nuclear power plants will become centres for new industries, new manufacturing and new investments. And as Australians will soon see, our plan will cost a fraction of the government's $1.3 trillion plan, a figure not even the Prime Minister's cricket team of Labor spin doctors can conceal. Much has been made about the position of premiers and state leaders. In government, I will work respectfully and collaboratively with state premiers, but I don't answer to them. The decisions I make, the decisions I make will be in our national interest to the benefit of the Australian people. Commonwealth laws override state laws to the level of the inconsistency. So support or opposition at a state level won't stop us rolling out a new energy system because it's in our national interest to do so. Now, I note in particular that my good friend David Crisafulli in Queensland is getting a hard time from the usual suspects, and if there is somebody in this debate who should be a cartoon character, it's Stephen Miles in Queensland. He's not a person who can be taken seriously because he's been a part of every decision that has sent Queensland backwards. He's been a part of every decision that's made Queenslanders angry and desperate for a change of government. I have the utmost respect for David. He's a dear friend, and he's taken a perfectly understandable position in relation to this debate. He's going to make an outstanding Premier in Queensland in a similar way that Jeremy Rockcliffe is at the moment in Tasmania. Every Queenslander knows that David Crisafulli will stand up for them. He'll deal with the issues of priority for Queenslanders. He'll clean up the enormous mess that Labor has left. Fellow Liberals, friends, we have the right energy policy, and it's a sensible energy policy. Poll after poll is showing that more and more Australians want to see our nation adopt nuclear power. According to Lowy, some 61% of Australians. According to Newspoll, some 65% of 18 to 34-year-olds. You know, it was amazing when we were negotiating the AUKUS deal with the United States and the United Kingdom. As Defence Minister, I assumed, having grown up in the latter part of the 70s and then the 80s, that there would be riots at universities, that students would glue themselves to my car when we were driving through the streets of our capital cities. That was the experience in the 80s whenever you talked about nuclear energy. There was none of that. There was none of that. And I must say that when we look around today, those people in the Green movement, those people in the Labor Party, and those people across Australian society who are most comfortable with the debate in relation to nuclear energy are people between the ages of 18 and 34. They're comfortable because they're well read, because they understand the modern technology, and they understand and have a passion for reducing emissions. And they know, whether they say it publicly or on social media, they know that they go to the election looking at a Liberal Party that for the first time is offering an environmental policy which is superior to that which the Labor and the Greens Party will offer up at the next election. It may hurt some of them a lot, but that's the reality of what they will face at the next election. Now, Australians are increasingly doing what the government doesn't want them to do. They're thinking pragmatically for themselves. Visionary Labor leaders like the late, great Bob Hawke knew that zero-emissions nuclear energy was a good thing. But Labor's current crop of leaders have been reduced to posting juvenile social media memes of three-eyed fish and koalas. I say that I draw the line at the eight-legged dog, which was some reflection on Ralph, who is an important part of our family, I might say. Now, Ralph is overweight, but he is not eight-legged. But it shows the juvenile nature of our Prime Minister. He's a man with a mind still captured in his university years. He's a child in a man's body, and he should be a Prime Minister for our country instead. And we need a mature conversation in our country. When we have a mature conversation, as we did in relation to AUKUS, we came together in a bipartisan way in the best interests of our country. And the time and the obligation now is for the Prime Minister to step up, to leave behind the sectional interests and the factional games, and to stop the juvenile banter. Frankly, their behaviour is an affront to the intelligence of voters whom they seek to represent. With 400 reactors operating worldwide today, more than 30 countries using nuclear power, and some 50 countries looking to introduce it for the first time, the facts continue to disarm Labor's childish propaganda. Australians want a rational conversation on energy policy, not a continuation of culture wars. Last year, they wanted a reasoned debate on The Voice without being called chicken littles. They asked their Prime Minister for detail, and it wasn't forthcoming. And now they also want a sensible discussion on how we can alleviate the national housing crisis without being labelled anti-migrant or racist. The Prime Minister's not even up for a mature debate on housing. Those who resort to those smear tactics to undermine the maturity of debate that Australians expect on the critical issue of housing supply don't deserve a position of leadership in our country. We're not a racist country. We're a proud country. We have an incredible migrant story of which we are all proud. Australians can see through the partisan agendas of commentators, including at the ABC, who have abandoned their journalistic objectivity. Australians understand the facts. In 2 years, the government has brought in an additional 932,000 migrants. Yet on the available data, only 265,000 homes have been built. Labor has created a housing crisis by opening up the floodgates without doing the proper planning and investment into infrastructure. If we want to relieve pressure on the housing market, infrastructure and services, we need a sustainable and well-managed program, not one where you bring in 1.67 million people, the population of Adelaide, over a course of 5 years, without providing additional funding, in fact taking money away for infrastructure. And that's why the Coalition will reduce the permanent migration program by 25% for 2 years, among other measures that I announced in my budget reply. We will free up 40,000 homes in the first year of a Coalition government and more than 100,000 homes over 5 years. We will do that because I won't stand for a situation in our country where Australians can only afford to go into home ownership if their parents can afford to provide them with financial support. Every Australian, every young Australian with a dream who aspires to home ownership and financial security will achieve it under a government that I lead. I want every Australian to own a little part of Australia. That is part of Menzies' dream for our country. A home is not only life's best financial asset, as John Howard pointed out last night, and as Elizabeth Lee pointed out this morning. It's one which makes retirement easier. A home is also a social asset. It provides the stability and security to settle down, to have the opportunity to start a family. And owning a home helps you get ahead. We've recommitted to allowing Australians to access up to $50,000 of their super to buy their first home. And we've extended this policy to separated women to help them restart their lives. Michael Sukkar and Andrew Bragg are working on further housing policies, which will send a very clear message to the Australian public that we want to make sure that we can increase on the supply side the houses that are available to Australia's aspiring homeowners. Of course, aspiration dies where crime thrives. The foundation of stability and success is law and order. Like all Australians, I've been appalled by the uptick in knife crime, in youth crime, particularly crime and violence against women, terrorist incidents and anti-Semitism in recent times. There are many reasons for this. Some of our courts have been too lenient in granting bail to repeat offenders. Some of our top-ranking police officers, as we know, have been reluctant to enforce the law out of fear of offending certain cultural sensitivities or stoking tensions in particular communities. But I believe the culture you set as Prime Minister is the culture that is accepted across the country. And the Prime Minister has failed that fundamental test. Whether it's on the streets of Alice Springs or the steps of the Sydney Opera House, our Prime Minister has failed to grasp a simple principle. The tolerance of intolerable events only creates more intolerable events. Ineptitude also creates more intolerable events, and catastrophic events can follow. Andrew Giles is one of the most incompetent immigration ministers since Federation. Not only has he released more than 150 hardcore criminals from immigration detention into the community, some of whom have reoffended, but he's also made it easier for criminal non-citizens to remain in Australia instead of being deported. The fact the Prime Minister still hasn't fired this negligent minister shows that he's more interested in protecting his factional friend than fighting crime. We're watching a Labor Party with a migration policy in a series of events that we've seen many times over. We know that Labor always gets it wrong when it comes to immigration policy. When we inherited a disastrous policy, when John Howard came to power, we made definite decisions. They were tough decisions, but they were in our country's interests. As Immigration Minister, I cancelled over 6,000 visas of people who had committed serious crimes, in particular against women and children. At the same time, I granted extensions of visas and Australia as a home as the outcome for those who couldn't have imagined enjoying the lifestyle that we do today or living in a safe country like we do. And I'm proud of that period, and we will restore integrity to our migration program. A weak border policy and the return of people smuggling ventures to our shores, as we're seeing now, is not in our national interest. A deficient detention policy which puts communities at risk. And I have some of the best in the business in James Patterson and Dan Tehan, who will help clean up Labor's mess. By restoring managed migration, by reviving strong borders and stopping people smugglers, by reinstating the moral and political leadership for effective law and order. We'll also toughen and tighten bail laws, and we will work with the states to develop national uniform knife laws to limit sales, restrict possession and provide powers to police to stop and search. Fellow Liberals and friends, we also cannot neglect the responsibility to the next generation in a digitally driven era. Australians are living very different lives compared with decades ago. Both parents are usually working, some in multiple jobs given the cost of living crisis. For single parents, the pressure is even greater. As Liberals, we don't believe in Big Brother government, which interferes in the lives of Australians or seeks to be a substitute for responsible parenting. Yet it's clear parents across the country are deeply concerned about the mental health ramifications of social media on impressionable young minds. Our children are more prone to depression and anxiety due to influencer culture and online bullying. At their fingertips is an abundance of sexually explicit and violent content. Some teens are even committing crimes for likes. Social media is rewiring young minds, and not in a good way. There's nothing more important to the future of our country than preserving the innocence of our children and nurturing young minds in a responsible way. And that's why David Coleman and I have announced that a coalition government will invest in age verification technology to restrict social media use for children under the age of 16. Relatedly, Sarah Henderson is working day and night, leading the pushback against indoctrination in our classrooms. That starts with a renewed focus on teaching our young children the basics through explicit instruction. A coalition government will make reading, writing and maths a priority, the bedrock for open minds and critical thinking. Fellow Liberals, as I said, our plan is to get our country back on track. It's a statement of our priorities and our policies, and we will have much more to say on both as the next election approaches. The next election will be a time for choosing, but the battle of ideas has already begun. The fight for the future and fate of this nation has already commenced. In my federal council address last year, I said that we had a party and that it was a party that is the sum of its people. Our success is built on your loyalty, on your passion, on your hard work and every effort, small and large, every day. In this 80th anniversary year of the birth of the Liberal Party, this is a time to find strength in our unity, confidence in our convictions, commitment in our duty to our fellow Australians and this great country which we love and cherish. As I say, do I think that the coalition can win the next election? Yes, I do. We can and we must for the sake of fellow Australians, not just because we seek to win for winning's sake, but because we are here as we've always been, for the forgotten Australians. For 80 years, we have fought for the forgotten Australians. I will lead a government for all Australians as we work together to get our great country back on track. Together with your assistance, your friendship, your support, your advocacy, your loyalty, we will do our very best for our great country. Thank you so much. Thank you.
what we have just witnessed is a substantive, comprehensive, compare and contrast options for the Australian people. A demonstration of the quality and substance of leadership this country so dearly needs. The maturity of being open to a public debate which respects the Australian people and engaging with the Australian people to take them on the journey. And if there was ever a demonstration of real leadership, it was Peter Dutton's address to Federal Council today. Congratulations, Peter. And to its core, demonstrated real Liberal values. You do us proud. This brings session 2 to a close, and I would ask delegates to return promptly at 1:30 for the next session of Federal